And thank you very, very much. I've got something here that I wanted to mention quickly. As I say, any minute now, we're expecting U.S. Senator Mike Crapo to pop through the door. And when he does that, we're just simply going to have him take a seat. We'll begin at that point, other than making him sit around and wait for a commercial break. That just seems to me, if he's made the effort to show up, we'll make an effort to try and get him on the air as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, a caller referenced in the last hour this net neutrality business and what it's going to mean. Now, there are people out there who make an argument it's only fair that I heard Bernie Sanders over the weekend, the socialist senator from Vermont, saying, well, we should, a blogger should be allowed to have just as much space and access to the internet as a great big newspaper does. All right. And I know what they're trying to say, but you see, with some of the restrictions we will have as the FCC gets involved, maybe even the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, they'll be telling people what they can and can't say. And that's the part that the left isn't telling you about. It's 32 at our studio, 7 minutes, coming up on 8 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is from watchdog.org, and I just highlighted a couple of lines from it. Happened to see it over the weekend and thought this was worthwhile mentioning. It's the 26th, which I believe is a week from Thursday or a week from Wednesday. Next week, the FCC will take on this matter, and likely it could be the end of the internet as we know it. What is net neutrality? That's the first thing they bring up. When you mention that name, the writer says, eyes glaze over. In concept, it is the idea that the internet should be equally accessible, i.e., neutral to all comers. Thus, a blogger should have equal access to internet speed and capability, just as Netflix does. So, you understand what they're saying? It's a level playing field. All right, most people may not want to read most blogs and would prefer Netflix, but it's saying, hey, look, there are some people out there who have something valuable to say. We shouldn't get in their way. The writer says, what's the matter with that? In concept, nothing, but in practice, everything. Supply of bandwidth is limited. It's like radio stations. The reason everyone doesn't get one is because there's only so much space in the spectrum. Bandwidth also requires electrical energy. The more used, the more power required. Those companies whose products require massive amounts of bandwidth, like Netflix, they pay higher prices. This is like paying a higher price for overnight versus 2 or 3 day mail delivery. Then enter the FCC. Net neutrality is being sold as a method to make broadband inexpensive. Net neutrality is a form of price control, though. By affording equal access to all comers at below cost, demand will skyrocket while supply dries up. And the writer says, if an ISP, that is your internet service provider, cannot provide internet access at a profit, it will go out of business. The government will then step in to take its place. Aha! You see how this goes? It's like if the government crashes the healthcare system, which it appears to be doing, then it has to step in and say, well, all right, we're now going to have socialized medicine, single payer they call it to try and confuse you. Same idea here. The government will become your internet service provider, and then the government controls everything on the internet. You understand how that works. And you've got a guy in the White House right now who has some totalitarian impulses, and that's why he is pushing this change. And he's been doing it for years. I gave a speech on net neutrality outside the state capitol in Dover, Delaware, way back in 2010, I believe it was. And people at the time were not really aware of what it would mean. But there you go. There's an answer. It's coming up on 11 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. And you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Good morning, Bill. Hey, couple of things. The IEN issue, a letter was actually sent out from the OCIO last Friday. It actually is going to affect the internet and network connections for every state agency. The other thing is on the healthcare issue. Look up statewide healthcare innovation plan. It's actually a new model that Idaho has received a grant to implement. And anyway, it'll address some of the issues I think that you were talking about regarding monopolies and that kind of thing. It's statewide healthcare innovation plan.
I thank you for the call. In fact, when it comes to healthcare, one of the best things I ever heard, there's a 7-minute YouTube video, and I know some people try to treat him as a crank and a kook, but Ron Paul, whose son is likely going to be running for president next year, Ron Paul had a video he put together. He said, look, before the rise of HMOs, Richard Nixon helped create those, we had indemnity plans, and they were affordable. We have to go back about 40-some years, though, to turn that clock back and try to do that. And you will also increase competition, which will lower costs. 12 after 9, you're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story. Uh-oh, the president's done it. He's gotten a hold of the internet already. And he's sending out his little subliminal messages to all of us. He's trying to, it's his attempt at mind control. Put on your tinfoil hat. That should be very, very helpful. I have a few of those around. I'm actually wearing one today. It's disguised as a Washington Nationals baseball cap, but it's foil lined. I went and got some Reynolds wrap when I bought it, and took care of the job, so I can walk around the streets and no one controls my mind. 33 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story, and you can reach the program today at 736-0300. That is 736-0300. There is, speaking of Ron Paul, his son Rand, senator from Kentucky, there is a piece today, if you get a chance, at WashingtonTimes.com by Bruce Fine. He says, only Rand Paul is qualified to be our next president if you are a constitutionalist. And he explains why. It's a very compelling argument. You should take a look at it. And you're on the air on Top Story and News Radio 1310 KLIX. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Bill, over the weekend, I had a missionary for the Mormon religion tell a story about what had happened in Detroit. And, there's some people believe that if the liberals, the communists, the socialists, the statists get their way, that we will end up literally like that. Have you ever been to Detroit and seen that disaster? Or
I was there. I was working on a U.S. Senate campaign in October, and I was stationed out in the suburbs in Livonia, and one of my best friends teaches at Detroit Mercy, and it is a nasty, nasty place.
Well, quickly, so we don't waste any more time, he was out doing his duty, and you really, whether or not you believe in the Mormon religion or not, these
right.
young men go out two at a time, and some of them are put in pretty precarious situations. And he said he walked up to a door because there was smoke coming out of the chimney, and there was a shoestring holding a door shut with no door handle, and they knocked, and the door, well, I don't know how they got in, but they didn't just walk in. And there was a mattress sitting in the corner with 9 little black children on it. And I guess the mother was around, or she may not have been around right then. And it was 2 feet of snow, and it was close to zero. And it was a disaster. And throughout these neighborhoods, this is a common thing.
Well, if you'd like to check out, speaking of videos, I think it's Steve Crowder has put out one about Detroit. It's about 12 or 13 minutes long, and it is just, I can remember when I went to see the movie Gran Torino, and I thought it can't really be that bad. You're looking at a movie and you're thinking this is just part of the set. But when I saw the Crowder video, it was an eye-opener. The movie actually cleaned it up somewhat, and yeah, you're right, it's third world. And we did not go campaigning in the city last fall because we just decided for our own safety it would be best to just work in the suburbs and as well maybe just make some telephone calls. No one wanted any part of that downtown, believe me, or even the outskirts of it, which have been pretty much abandoned by the city government itself. 916, thank you for the call. I have a very special guest who's joining us at the studio, and I'm going to make sure I've got a microphone on here so he can say a quick hello.
Good morning.
Good morning, Senator. First of all, I've been mentioning we're going to have a guest coming up today, and Senator Mike Crapo has agreed graciously to join us this morning. When he said 9:15, I didn't realize he meant 9:15. I covered Mario Cuomo years ago as a young reporter, and if it said 9:15, it was 11:15.
Well, I'm one of those guys that actually does still show up on time. There's very few of them in the Senate these days.
Welcome, first of all.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
I was going to say, as you were coming in, I was thinking a number of things we could talk about today, but right off the top, we've got a break in about 3 minutes. You're doing a series of town meetings in the area.
Yes, that's right. I don't know exactly what the number is. I think we're doing 3 today. But I'm trying to get all around the entire state. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm doing town meetings in the big cities like we always do. But we're trying to get into the smaller communities as well. And by the time we're done, we hope to literally just network the entire state and go to virtually every incorporated city in the state. It's a big goal, but if we can get there, and we'll get to some of the unincorporated places too, it's going to be fun.
I was going to say you were out early today, so it's already underway.
Yeah, we're going. We're going full speed.
Well, early in the morning, you get to meet most of the senior citizens because they don't sleep past sunrise.
I understand that.
You have how many days before you head back?
Go back we start back up again next Monday, so I haven't counted so it's a week basically from today, and we've been out here for 2 or 3 days already.
There is just so much, and I've been watching on my monitor up here in the corner this morning some of what's going on around the world. And again, we only have a couple of minutes to the break, but I've been seeing these pictures coming up from Libya and various places in the Middle East, and gosh, you start to wonder, is World War III coming up, or did we just go through somewhat of a rehearsal in the last 10 years?
You know, it's really unfortunate that, and I'm going to be pretty critical of the president on this as we discuss it, but the fact is that the United States has given up so much ground that we made over the last 10 years. And now the fighting is starting basically anew with a re-strengthened insurgency. The enemy's changed names from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, and they may evolve again into other names, but the bottom line is that the president does not have a strategy, and now he has again pursued what I consider to be a policy of appeasement, asking Congress to authorize him to use force when he already has the authorization to do so, and putting in his requested authorization what we won't do as a country, so we can signal to our enemies what we won't do and what our timelines are. I don't understand it. I don't think most military personnel understand it either.
Mm-hmm. And for people who are sitting back and just horrified by what they're seeing lately, there's almost a sense of powerlessness. And I guess that's the worst part of it, is we're sitting back and we feel we can't do anything.
It's an extreme frustration, and we have that same frustration here domestically, whether it's our healthcare policy or the environmental policy or the regulatory policy. But when it comes to our national security, and we feel helpless because our own president will not take the kinds of stands that will assure our security, I think Americans are starting to get fearful.
I would say that it's almost a revival of that fear that was here back about 7 years ago.
Yeah, I think you're right. I really believe that this is a real enemy. If we do not stop this enemy, there is a very serious risk that we will see attacks here on our homeland.
We have more coming up. U.S. Senator Mike Crapo joining us in studio, as well as he may have a few minutes later in the hour to take some of your telephone calls as well. He's got a series of town hall meetings going on around the area. As he pointed out, pretty much his entire schedule filled with those today. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, 34 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. As I had mentioned a little earlier, we have a guest in studio with us, U.S. Senator Mike Crapo. And he's taking some telephone calls a bit later, too. We're also talking a little bit about some of the most, notorious things in the news right now, and that's what's happening in North Africa and in the Middle East, is we have a terrorist problem that looks to be just mushrooming at this point. By the way, if there's another headset over there, somebody from your staff could listen in, right? So I can't see beyond the computers. I didn't know if anyone was doing that. That way they can hear calls, etc., whatever. We can do hand signals.
All right. This is my wife, Susie. She's getting out.
Okay. All right. So she gets to hear all the nice callers today.
All right.
We guarantee that they will be polite, if not necessarily always nice. Or is that maybe?
Works. I
guess the definitions are similar. 924, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We could just get back to that subject for a few more minutes. The president has asked for a resolution, I guess you'd call it. That's right. It's not a declaration of war, but at least an ability to respond to this problem over there.
In effect, it should be, in my mind, treated as a declaration of war, but it's called an authorization for the use of military force. And it seems to me that when the president deems the circumstances are such that he needs to ask for this authorization, which, by the way, this president already has under previous actions of the Congress, it seems to me that he should ask for unlimited authorization. And so that, first of all, we don't tell our enemies what it is that we are authorized to do and what it is that we won't do. Instead, he wants it to have a 3-year term so that our enemy knows it's a 3-year authorization only. Mm-hmm. He wants it to be to have prohibitions in there against certain uses of our ground forces. and frankly, there are. He wants to repeal the previous authorizations, which were unlimited. And so I just think that this is a bad signal to our allies and our enemies across the globe, as well as to the American people, in terms of whether this president has a strategy and whether he's willing to engage in the kinds of acts that are necessary to protect our people.
I see a lot of the pundits in the newspaper op-ed pages saying that the country has war fatigue, but when I came home yesterday afternoon and I looked at Drudge and I saw all of those headlines, 5 or 6 of them about all of these atrocities taking place, there is that thought that it may be 1939 all over again. Just we could end up in a commitment, I would imagine, that is that big. Are we ready for that? Are we willing?
Well, I have a different take on that than I continue to hear in the national media, and it's this. I don't think we should use military force anywhere in the globe unless our national security requires it. And then, if we determine that our national security requires it, we should allow the men and women in our military to have the rules of engagement to win. And I think the fatigue we have in the country is continuously being at war or going into engagements, but being unwilling to allow our military to achieve its military objectives and win. And I've got fatigue of that. I don't want to send our men and women back into conflict anywhere in the globe if we're going to tie their hands behind their backs. And I know that means some pretty serious things. I know that it means that we are going to have to accept some collateral damage that happens in fighting wars, and that we are going to have to not blame our men and women and prosecute our soldiers for the very damaging things that happen in war. And obviously, I'm not suggesting that they should be able to do atrocities or anything like that, but we've got to be able to have the rules of engagement to win. And I think Americans would support that kind of an engagement to defend our shores against an enemy.
Plus, with the just the ability we have technologically, I would imagine the force we could bring to bear could wrap this up a lot more quickly than what we did over the last decade.
Yes, that's increasingly becoming true. Increasingly, we aren't going to be able to just fight all wars remotely, but we are increasingly able to use technology and remote warfare, if you will, like we do with drones today, in a way that helps to achieve our military objectives. But again, the fights we get into over our use of drones, and our use of drones has been something that I'll give the president credit for. He has been using them, I think, quite effectively, and I would encourage that Americans support him in that.
We have about a minute and a half before our break. Callers, hold on. We'll get to some of the callers in the next half hour. The president, though, has done somewhat of an about-face. It's no longer the JV squad. He's now talking at least about 4,000 troops going overseas. So at least there's some recognition on his part.
Yes, I think that the American public is frankly forcing him to take this more seriously. He did lecture us all a few weeks ago at the prayer breakfast, saying, the Christians have a history of being evil and killing people throughout history as well. But for him to even make that comparison, I think, has caused a lot of people in this country to step back once again and say, well, wait a minute, does he get it? But I do believe that the public pressure is causing him to recognize that this is way more than just a JV game. This is a full score battle, I believe. And like I said earlier, I believe that the enemy we face today has the desire and the intent and may soon get the capacity to attack us on our own soil.
About 30 seconds before the break, a number of your U.S. Senate colleagues are possibly going to replace him in a couple of years.
I hope so.
Have they come to you yet, any of them, and said, hey, are you going to be on my team?
None of them have specifically asked yet. I think it's probably because they know that most of us in the Senate are stepping back and observing. I don't have a choice yet. And it may or may not be one of my Senate colleagues. My focus and my priority is someone who will win the presidency. And I'm waiting to see who can really show that trajectory that we talked about earlier as to whether or not they can do so.
We've got more coming up with U.S. Senator Mike Crapo. You're listening to Top Story and some of your telephone calls as well. Don't go away. 34 at 9:30. Our guest in the studio with us this morning is U.S. Senator Mike Crapo, and he's talking about some issues currently taking place in really around the world as well as nationally. I know we have a couple of folks who'd like to get in touch with us too as well, and you might have a question or comment. I've asked people to keep those brief. I don't want any statement callers. Stick to a question, and so we can give someone else an opportunity to follow. Right now, going to call it 34, and you're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. 736-0300, 736-0300. Our first caller is with us. Senator,
all right.
You've got your armor on. So
all right, I'm ready.
You're on the air with U.S. Senator Mike Crapo. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd just like to ask the Senator to read these trade bills that are coming up with the EU and the Pacific Partnership. Most of our trade bills have been very one-sided. Has he read the bill, and will he take a stand and vote no on fast track so Congress can actually debate this thing? I'd like him to answer that. Thank you.
First of all, let me say, with regard to trade in general, I think I know exactly where the caller is coming from, and I agree. I believe we should have free trade agreements, and fair trade agreements is a word that I think should be put in there. And the United States has a history of not negotiating well on our trade agreements. We both give up concessions that we shouldn't, and we give up our own sovereignty in these trade agreements, and we should not do that. And so even though I'm a strong supporter of our trade agreements, of the notion that we should engage in trade negotiations and expand our economic reach in our country through trade negotiations, we need to get good agreements. Because of that, I have voted against a number of them. I voted against NAFTA, I voted against CAFTA, I voted against a number of the trade agreements that I felt were poorly negotiated. With regard to Trade Promotion Authority or Fast Track, I'm on the committee that will consider that. And if it is put forward in the fashion that it is proposed, I cannot support it. And so I will tell the caller that. There are some efforts underway now by a number of us on the conservative side to try to rewrite it in a way that will give Congress and give America a better ability to have a pressure from Congress and an input from Congress rather than just giving the president a fast track where he wants it so that he can pack it full of not only bad deals like I've just described, but pack it full of labor and environmental policies that should not be in the agreement at all. So we're engaged heavily on that issue right now. And I think I can say to the caller that I understand where he comes from and agree with his perspective on these issues.
I think we have another caller with us. It's 9:36 and it's 34 at our studios. And you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Good morning. I was wondering how long is too long to serve in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I know there's a big notion out there that we should have very short levels of service. And I, as you know, I've served in the House for 6 years and in the Senate for 12 years. I don't believe that the tenure is the key. As I look at some of my strong conservative colleagues in the Senate, some are brand new. Some of my good friends and allies like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz, and some have been there for a long time, much longer than I have, like Jeff Sessions and some of the other very strong allies there. And the same thing is true on what I would consider to be the liberal side of the agenda. There are a bunch of new ones who are very liberal. There's a bunch of those who have been there a long time who are very liberal. And to me, it depends on their politics. I think no time is too long for somebody who's voting wrong.
We have something called elections too, which that's where you term limit
and that's where I really believe these kinds of issues should be addressed. If a person is advocating aggressively for the right kinds of policies and principles by which people feel we should govern ourselves, then I think that person should have an opportunity to seek re-election and succeed. On the other hand, if somebody who's been brand new and just been there for one term is out there pushing an agenda that's harmful to our country and moving us in the wrong direction, then it's not soon enough to try to put somebody else in place.
And I was going to say, in the case of like a Jeff Sessions, he defeated another conservative in Jeremiah Denton to win that seat in the first place. So voters will make those choices from time to time.
They will. That's exactly right.
We have another caller with us, and believe you, caller, you're on the air with us right now. It's 9:38. We've got about a minute or so before we have our break, so you've got to make it a quick question.
Okay. Mike, I want to suggest that you consider looking into a 10th Circuit Court for the Great Northwest instead of this liberal 9th Circuit Court that's ruling Idaho.
First of all, I'm shaking my head yes as you're asking the question. Not only do I agree with you, but I have been doing so for years. We don't have the votes yet to do so, but the Ninth Circuit has the reputation of being the most overturned circuit and the most liberal circuit in America, and Idaho is burdened with being in that circuit. We are trying to figure out how to draw the boundaries in such a way that we can get the votes to do so. We've made several runs at it, and we'll continue to look at it. I think that the caller raises a very valid concern.
Just with population shifts, too, I would think that eventually you have to look at those lines and ask yourself, is it time to make a change?
Yeah, you do.
We've got more on the way. In fact, the senator is going to take a couple of minutes in the next segment of the program. I know we wanted to mention a couple of points about health care as well, and we wanted to get to that. In the meantime, it's 35 at our studios, 20 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Also, Mike Huckabee, the Huckabee Report, is up at 9:50 this morning. Hope you can stick around. Our guest in the studio this hour, U.S. Senator Mike Crapo, and he's joining us on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. And right now, 35 at our studios, coming up on 9:44. As I mentioned earlier, the Huckabee Report is coming along in just a few minutes. That will be brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. 736-6563. Also, just wanted to mention, we're going to be joined by some guests in a couple of days from Western States Bus Services, where they're hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay $10.75 per hour. Apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Senator, a few minutes before you got into the studio with us, we had some callers talking about the healthcare system.
Yes.
And you came in, and while we were off the air, we got chatting a little bit about some of these issues. And here we are again, where we seem to have, depending on who I read in the media, if you're reading a left-wing columnist, it's all working out well. If I'm reading the Washington Times, not quite so much.
Yeah.
Where are we going with all of it?
It's not working out well. In fact, it's working out exactly the way I and many others said when we were fighting it on the floor. The taxes are kicking in. It's $1.5 trillion or so of new taxes that are slamming the middle class, contrary to the president's statement. The president said the average person in America would see their health care premiums go down by $2,500. People are seeing them just skyrocket by thousands and thousands more than that. The number of people who did not have health care who now do have health care has gone up a little bit because of the new subsidy that was put in the program. But what's causing a counterbalancing problem is a lot of people who did have health care through their employer now don't have health care through their employer because employers are dropping their health care coverage. There's a rule that any employer of more than 50 people has to provide health care, and what those employers are doing is simply hiring only 49 people. We're putting people on part-time work rather than full-time work. And basically my point is it's hitting us in the taxes, it's hitting us in the cost of our health care, it's hitting us in terms of access to work and in jobs and employment, and the quality of health care is suffering. So I personally think we have a real crisis. We're going to continue to push to repeal Obamacare. And as I think everybody in the country knows, we face a filibuster in the Senate and a veto from the president. That's an uphill fight, but we're going to fight that fight. And at the same time, we're sponsoring and pushing legislation across the board to pick off different pieces of it where we can get a broader base of support and take them out.
So there is a Republican plan, despite what Eugene Robinson might say.
Yeah, there's been a Republican plan since the first day we started fighting over Obamacare, and it's a much better plan, and I'm very hopeful that one of these days the national media will get off of this just mantra of saying, well, the Republicans just don't like Obamacare, but they don't have an alternative. We have great alternatives, both in terms of what needs to be done to Obamacare, all the way from repealing it to the different pieces that we need to knock off if we can't, as well as what it needs to be replaced by.
We have another caller looking to join us, and our caller is on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX with our guest, U.S. Senator Mike Crapo. And what's on your mind, caller?
I just have a question. With all of the immunization talk, why have we not heard anything about them immunizing all of the illegals that are coming in? No, we can give them Social Security and we can give them health care and everything. Why can't we immunize them?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I do know the answer to the fact to what the caller indicated, which is that we are giving now somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million people who have entered the country illegally a Social Security card, a Social Security number, which means that they are going to be able to access a number of benefits, and they may be able to access immunization benefits. I just don't know, and I'll have to check that out. But one of the things that came up in the Finance Committee on which I sit recently is that they are able to access tax refunds for taxes they never paid. And it's remarkable. They are going to be given payments by the federal government under the Earned Income Tax Credit and one other provision that I'm forgetting the name of right now, where they will be able to literally be paid by the United States taxpayers because they have that Social Security card number, and it's remarkable. It's not a refund of taxes paid. It's actually basically a welfare payment of money just being paid through the tax code, so that it can be called by the administration a tax refund.
I read late last week that too. There's the real concern that these people could as well end up voting in future elections because it's so difficult to catch the fraud.
Oh, absolutely. And I know that that's a part of the reason. I personally believe that that's one of the reasons the president did this. Some states have tried to require photo ID so that you can prove your citizenship or prove your residence before you can vote. And this administration has stopped those states from doing that, and actually entered into legal battles with a number of those states to stop them from doing that. We've tried to pass legislation on the floor of the Senate multiple times, and I hope we do it again this year, that has said that you have to have some kind of an ID, or a state can at least require that you have some kind of ID before you're allowed to vote. And we have been stopped from even getting a vote on that legislation until now. I think we're going to get a vote on it now.
Let's hope so. You now have the control to do it.
Oh, yes. We now have the ability to put our agenda on the floor. We still face filibusters and vetoes, but we are the Democratic agenda, Harry Reid and his agenda has been stopped. And our agenda is now on the floor. We're winning on some of it. We're losing on some of it. For example, we were able to pass through some major reforms in the financial arena with Dodd-Frank reforms. We were able to pass the XL pipeline vote in the Senate and beat the filibuster there. We may still face a veto on that, but we're winning some, we're losing some, but we're debating our issues and we're voting now on our issues.
Hold that thought, and we've got a couple of minutes to wrap up with the senator in just a few minutes. In the meantime, the Huckabee Report with Governor Mike Huckabee. And the Huckabee Report is brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. You can telephone 736-6563. Just a couple of minutes before we wrap up, coming up on 9:55, U.S. Senator Mike Crapo joining us in studio. I'm Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. Town hall meetings, you're crisscrossing the state. I give you credit for doing that because I know a few years ago there were people who just, in one party who didn't like to do those at all.
Well, I find it's really fun. And we should have mentioned it before exactly where. At 10:30 today, we'll be at the Twin Falls City Council chambers. At 11:30, we'll be at the CSI Fine Arts Auditorium. And at 3:30, we will be at Jerome in the Jerome Senior Center. So for folks who want to come out and talk more about what's going on in the world and in America, I'd love to see you come and show up.
I think we may have one caller who was trying to get through and
Sure.
may have lost them. But if you'd like, feel free, of course, to try to squeeze a call in. We've only got about 2 minutes left, though. And before we do wrap up, you mentioned during the break budget discussions going on in Washington. By golly, when I saw that figure that the president proposed, is there any notion in these people's minds that we'll ever be able to pay this back?
I don't think they ever have any desire to. The president has once again put forward what I called your standard old tax and spend budget. He wants another $2.1 trillion of new taxes. He claims it's on the wealthy, but when you look at it, it's across the board, and the middle class gets hit just as hard as anybody else does. And he wants to spend another $3+ trillion. That's on top of the spending patterns that the Congress already has. A 7% spending increase next year. And just to give you some, and by the way, as you might guess, his budget never balances. And just to give you the dire numbers, when he took office, the national debt was $10 trillion. And we had a crisis then. And the national debt is today $18 trillion. And under his proposed budget, it will go up over the next 10 years to about $26.5 trillion. And interest on the national debt will, within a few short years, 4 or 5 or 6 years, be larger than our entire national defense spending and larger than our entire non-defense spending outside of our entitlement programs.
Think about that, too, with a crisis like we're seeing in North Africa and the Middle East. If that does come to our shores and we can no longer...
Yeah. And our national debt, well, as you probably know, one of our chiefs of staff of the military told us recently, a few years back, that the greatest threat to our national security was the national debt. And now we're starting to see that happen.
And yet, I don't know how you can ever pay this back. I mean, I think there's some notion that it's just impossible, other than inflating it away.
Well, there are those who want to just inflate it away, and that would be devastating to our economy and to jobs and to the quality of life and the American dream. But we could pay it back if we were to get onto a pathway of balancing. If we can once balance the budget and reform our tax code, which I wish we'd had more time. Next time maybe we can talk about what we need to do in our tax code, but make American business more competitive. Instead of having a tax code that makes us the highest corporate tax rate in the world and the most anti-competitive code we could have come up with, we can generate economic growth. And while we're building jobs and businesses, we are also generating the revenue for our federal government to get a handle on its debt. We could do it, but we've got to get into the right kind of policies.
Again, very quickly, you have some town hall meetings coming up, and you're on your way to the next one, 10:30 this morning at City
the
Council?
Chamber of Commerce. Chamber of Commerce,
rather.
Yes.
All right, get that straight. One of my predecessors would have said that I actually, in some cases in Twin Falls, they're the same. But I won't go that far. 9:58. Rush Limbaugh coming up following news at 10 o'clock. We'd like to thank U.S. Senator Mike Crapo for joining us in studio on Top Story, and all of you for your telephone calls as well. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. God willing and the creek don't rise, I'll be back with you tomorrow, 8 o'clock in the morning, right here.